Game data.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Game Data. Today on the show, I am excited to share a conversation I had with Leader Games' Cole Wehrle. Cole, as you may know, is not a video game designer. He is a board game designer. And not only that, but he's designed games that you might have heard of or seen if you've wandered the board game shelves of Target. He's designed awesome games like Root, Oath, and most recently, by all accounts, 2024's best game, Arcs, as well as worked deeply on historical strategy games with his brother on his historical games imprint, Whirligig Games, shipping games like John Company and Pax Pamir, both deep historical complex simulations. I want to talk to Cole a lot about how he thinks about designing games and how he thinks about the sort of data that goes into the designs that he works on, especially because his games are often about simulation and kind of provoking player experience. We talk about random number generators, we talk about graphic design, we talk about how his process has had to evolve as Leader Games has gotten bigger and bigger over time. It's a wide-ranging conversation that covers effectively all of Cole's games, and I hope that you find something in it that you can enjoy. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Game data.
Welcome, Cole, to Game Data.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to talk about as much or as little as my oeuvre as you'd like.
Don't pull out too much oeuvre right now. We're just getting the podcast started. I don't want to give it all away. So, assuming that someone who's coming to this podcast is primarily someone who plays video games, how would you describe kind of yourself and your position in board games to someone that's maybe more familiar with video games, but also, I don't know, maybe just a more casual consumer of playing media that you can play with?
Sure. So I am by profession a board game designer, which is a strange thing to say. There just aren't that many people who do this full time, but I'm one of them. And I'm even odder in this context because I don't come from the traditional paths that create full-time game designers. There are people, of course, who design games full-time. Many of them come through what we might think of as like the Hasbro pipeline, or they might have worked for one of the big publishers. I really got plucked out of like an odd corner of historical games and then worked with a company called Leader Games. Well, I'll give a slightly more robust history. After I finished my graduate work, I had done some historical games, and I got offered a job at a little company called Leader Games in St. Paul, and I moved up to join it, and we made this game Root, which is an asymmetric strategy game that was a massive, massive hit. And that hit has allowed the studio to scale up, and instead of just making Root 2 and Root 3 and Root 4, we decided to keep making odd, strange, and even bigger games
that all have 4 letters in their name.
That all have. It's about the only place where we're a little doctrinaire, it's a funny thing because when I tell people sometimes that I'm a full-time game designer, they're like, "Oh, well, that's odd. I assume all full-time game designers kind of follow your footsteps or your path, or we're all kind of doing the same thing." That just isn't true. I have a very weird job. I now serve as the company's creative director, where we manage 2 or 3 games in production at a time. And because our audience, an audience gathered around our game, this is a crazy introduction, but the audience that we found that's gathered around these pretty deep strategy games is a very peculiar kind of new audience. And so when we go to publish a game, I'm not really worried about winning a big game prize or trying to make it on the shelf of Target. I'm just worried about making this core audience happy. I'm interested in exciting them. And if they like it, they might tell their friends, and it kind of has been organically growing. But it allows us to more or less ignore the rest of board gaming. So we're in this funny little island where I feel like we just get to make incredibly ambitious projects that we're interested in and not worry about anything else. So it's an odd place, but I'll say
you're describing what sounds like heaven to a designer. You're like, you just get to do what you want, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm trying to be honest. It's not a brag, but I think that sometimes when I compare notes with other people who know working full time in the industry, they describe jobs that I would hate to have. There's a lot of kind of trust invested in this. So I'm in a position now where I get to run big projects sometimes, and when I'm not running big projects, I am helping give resources to designers who are starting out their first or second or third game with the company. And those might be expansions to existing lines, or they might be fully new games. But I'm best known for Root and Oath, and then this year our game Arcs. And while that's gone on, I've been able to keep doing historical games. Historical games tend to be a lot slower for reasons that we might end up talking about. But in the position I'm at right now, I find that most of the games I work on take, 2 to 3 years to execute. So I'm very happy if I can have a game come out every year or even every other year. And then in all of my other time, I'm trying to use that to get other players through the process, or other designers through the process as cleanly as possible. And the key thing I would want to say, and this is a rambling introduction, but the thing I want to lead into is the studio that we built at Leader Games is also a little unique, because basically everything that we design and develop is initiated internally. And that means we are operating more like a small software company in the early 1990s or 80s than we are like a modern video game company or like even a modern board game company, which mostly run like book publishers.
Right. And I think that also, just to maybe like contrast that a little bit with like a sort of a stereotypical board game designer, typically even like the most successful people, the ones that are really successful are often successful mostly due to sort of surface area of releases per year. Mm-hmm. So like people that are able to put out 4 and 5 games a year, each game does like, okay, maybe 1 or 2 kind of hit, and that's like enough to maybe sustain them a little longer. Very few people are able to just kind of work on 1 or 2 things a year, let alone 2 or 3 years. And so you're obviously in like obviously a privileged position, but also kind of a very unique position where it's not like, it's hard to look around you and even necessarily feel like you have peers just in terms of your like day-to-day effort, because, you can talk to a designer over the course of a year and they're like, why are you still trying to fix Root? And you're like, well, I have 2 years to do it.
Yeah.
It's like,
this is probably the biggest single point of distinction I find between people who are working at our studio and the broader design community. Most people who are working at the studio have 1 active project at most, maybe 2.
Sure.
When I talk to freelance designers, I mean, they're playing a numbers game. They might have 10 active games. The first time I sat down for a pitch session at a convention where I was on the publisher's side of the table, I remember someone came and showed us a game and we didn't like it. And the demonstration was maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And then they showed us another game and we didn't like it. And then they went to another game. And I realized after about an hour that I was going to have to tell this person to stop showing us prototypes because they seem to have a limitless bag of these things.
Yeah. And you guys don't, I guess, just another like small little level setting thing. Leader doesn't publish games at all. I'm trying to think, there might be like one pseudo published thing, but everything is internal. It's like, I've sort of compared you all to like Pixar, not just in terms of like prestige or bigness or whatever, but specifically that like you are a studio that specifically operates on internally initiated projects that you incubate to then release with internal teams. You are not sourcing from outside or anything at all. You might hire new people, obviously, but it's not like someone pitches you an idea, which is actually not the case for your sort of historical imprint, Whirligig, which I think obviously has done John Company, which is your game, and Pax Pamir. But I believe you've signed 2 external games to that label. So it's separate. Yeah.
There's an important, at Leader, we have done external designs, but they are so peculiar that they're worth talking about. So the golden rule for these external designs is, 1, we call you. Basically, in the case of a game called Fort, it had been a very small release that was very intriguing. I really liked it, and I felt like it needed a broader audience and a little bit of development work. And so we took it upon ourselves to kind of do a new edition or reinterpretation of that game. As part of that process, instead of just signing the game, what we usually do is we take it into development, internal development, where we rebuild the game from scratch, work on it for 3 to 6 months, and then we show it back to the original designer and say, are you okay with what we've done to your child? And if they are, then we will draw up an agreement and publish it. And if they aren't, we can go our separate ways and there's no hurt feelings. We've done that with a couple other games. So we did that with Ahoy. And, I could see a world where we do that in the future, but even those external games are being treated as if they were internal, which means at the very beginning, we were having conversations about art, scope of design. And we want, if someone wants to undergo that process with us, I try to be very clear about how dramatic it might change the game that they submit.
Yeah, I guess just for some context around Fort, right? That was originally a game about like, it was called SPQR, and it was like sort of Roman. It was like Roman era.
Yeah, it was originally a civilization game.
Yeah, no, it's like literally kids in like tree houses.
Yeah.
So it's quite different thematically. So I want to like get into this stuff. I think that's like some really good background. One of the first things that put you on my radar was, I think this might have been pre-Root Kickstarter, but I remember reading Board Game Geek, and I was looking into some of your work. And I don't know if Root was maybe in Kickstarter at this point. That's probably why I was looking you up in the first place. But I remember seeing you talk about one of your previous games, which is one of your sort of historical games that may have been your first published design, just for like, Cole Wehrle trivia. A game called In Infamous Traffic that is about, was it the opium trade in China, I believe?
Yeah.
And what I saw was really unique was that I saw that you had you actually used like Python, the programming language, to like game out different outcomes, I think, based on kind of what cards could potentially come into play, like as part of playing the game, which like to me as a video game designer and programmer that programs every day seems like very obvious as a thing you'd want to try. But as I sort of understood the context in which you were talking about it, and also having kind of watched the board game scene from afar at this point, seems actually like very unique. And so I kind of got interested into just your process, which you then sort of delivered on, because you were also one of the, I don't want to say most prolific, but when a game is coming to Kickstarter, it's almost just like part of the press cycle now for the game, where you do these like really big devlogs, effectively like designer diaries, kind of leading up to the launch and through the launch of a Kickstarter. You did it for definitely Oath. You might have done it for Root, and I believe you also did it for Arcs. And as part of that, I saw a lot more of this sort of data-oriented mindset from you as like a designer. And so I'm interested just to kind of like maybe start circa like Root Kickstarter launch, or maybe a little bit before that, and just think about like how you started to look at, I want to say, data, but I think it's also from a board games perspective, is something about like organization and design, and this like, in the context of game data as it's been conceived as part of this podcast, it's obviously like there's an external data source and there's like the internal data source, and those are kind of the same, they interact. But a board game almost feels like you're always working with data as an object, because there is this printed material, right? There's no like, a card is effectively a canvas, has to be imprinted on it, and what goes on that is implicitly data, which is like a distinction that is much more fuzzy in video games. So I'm just sort of interested if you can maybe start about how you sort of, I don't know if there's a way you would sort of describe your process generally, and maybe talk about how that kind of manifested when you started working on something like Root.
Well, I'm going to take that prompt in a very like circuitous way, because my favorite thing about games, and I think this is true of all games, but I feel like it's most true of tabletop games, is that they have to, it's sort of about number systems and seeing the interaction of systems visually. So you're always mapping things spatially. And the example I always think about is there's this amazing series of war games called The Great Campaigns of the American Civil War. And when you want to move one of your units in the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series, you have to roll a d6, and then the result that you get is how far your units move. And it's kind of an insane system. It's actually even funnier than that, because before you make that roll, you have to roll to see whose turn it is. So we'll roll, and whoever rolls higher gets to make a move. And then I'll pick one of my units, and then I'll roll a die, and it gets to move that many spaces. And then after that, we're going to roll dice and see who gets to move. And that's the core loop of the game. But this does something
which is very not like wargamey, to be clear, for the audience. Like that.
Oh yeah,
like,
this is not like, this is not a normal game.
That's like heresy, yeah.
But it creates, just conceptually, it creates this amazing moment where you'll get a 6. You're like, I'm going to choose this this little elite brigade. I'm going to roll. Oh, I rolled a 6. Boy, I could make it all the way to that town. Okay, I'll move him to that town. And then you'll roll like garbage. And your little guy is stuck. He's in front of the army. And it creates like just this, it's almost a classic like tactical problem of like overexposed positions. It's very organic. And the reason why this is a germane example is because it's a hex map. You're playing a game with 6-sided dice, and the probability of those dice, the range from kind of 0 to 6 is everywhere in like how the whole system like is mapped. it's just so interested in how the D6 sits inside of the game and what that means for how you understand things spatially, right? And so when you're building, I'm always really interested when I look at a game to look at like where the number one is in a game, because it sort of tells you something about the core exchanges, the core ratios, the core like assumptions of the number system that the whole game is built on. And some games are really good about the number one, and other games it's a huge stumbling block because as most developers know, one is a horrible number for game design. It's horrible because especially in analog games, because you can really only double it. It's very difficult in an analog game to work in 1 1/4 or 1 1/3 or whatever. And so, a lot of the mistakes I'll see a new designer do is that they'll kind of reach for the easy numbers first, as opposed to starting to think with something that's got more factors. So this has been the case for me for a long time. It's always been something that's attracted me in games. There's this old war game design called Titan that I think is just gorgeous. The kind of math of the game is unbelievable, extremely elegant. You'd never guess it because the theme of the game is sort of like a monster Royal Rumble where you're hiring cyclopses to beat up your opponent's dragons or whatever. But actually, in that game, all of the units have 2 statistics. They have a strength and a skill statistic, and each statistic is kind of doubly inscribed. Strength is your hit points and also how many dice you roll in combat. And skill determines your hit ratios. Higher skill creatures hit better, but also skill informs how many spaces you can move. And if you want to know the experience point value of a monster, you just multiply those 2 numbers together. And so you look at the roster of these monsters, and you're like, oh, they've counted to 8 with these 2 variables in every combination. Or not every combination, but in the combinations that are meaningfully different within the system of the game. And you can instantly know that like, oh, that's an 18-2. It's a big dumb serpent, but it's an 18-2. It's got so much life and just no skill. And a ranger is like a 4-4, and very balanced, so I've always been very compelled by those things. And when I was starting to become interested in game design and kind of pursuing it seriously, which started mostly as classroom exercises. And I used games. I think I've always liked learning through games. And so one exercise that I would do if I was in a history class that was hard or was trying to learn a tricky system, I would try to find games on the subject, or I would just I would find myself looking for those games kind of I wasn't doing it for my own education. I was just wondering like, I wonder if there's ever been a game about Pericles or something. And sometimes I wouldn't find a game, and I would just find myself like sketching out, like, I wonder the Byzantine tax system. I remember I was in a class on Byzantine history, and I was learning about the themes, which were these kind of administrative units of the Byzantine Empire. And I started imagining how like a little game would work about that subject. And in order to get better at imagining these games, I wanted to read about the making of games. And I was so disappointed to find that, at least in the world of tabletop games, there just wasn't a lot of good writing done by designers explaining what they were doing.
Right.
Now, this is a very specific complaint because there is a lot of really good tabletop writing. And there's even like a lot of good strategy articles. But the one that really got me was, I remember reading an interview with Martin Wallace, who's a designer I really admire. And he described how when he was working on this game Brass, which is a great economic game about the Industrial Revolution, he switched the action system to a card system, and it just worked better. I mean, that's pretty much verbatim what he wrote in this article. And I was so frustrated in that moment because I thought, surely you must know why it's working better. But for a lot of people working in tabletop, it's just highly intuitive. They are thinking about what's working and what's not working, but they're not thinking about how to describe that difference. And so which is
also like, it's a skill, right? It's a thing that like, it's very easy to see even in like video games that the people who are able to speak cogently about their practice and the people who are able to make good games is not like a Venn diagram overlap of a circle. It's like a very small middle section of like who can sort of speak about what they're doing and who can actually, walk the walk, so to speak. So it's definitely, it's shared, and it is hard to find because it's a skill that it has to be, deliberately honed separate to designing itself.
Well, and I had cut my teeth talking about games really before even designing them, because I fell in
and writing a
love.
lot, right?
Yeah, and writing a lot.
You're a PhD candidate, like you.
Yeah, I
wrote a lot.
I was a big English dork. I love reading and writing. Essays are fun. I would always in high school write essays for my fellow students if they were like complaining about it, and they're like, I can't play Counter-Strike until I write my paper on Faulkner. I'm like, I'll write your paper on Faulkner. That was, I'm sorry to Mrs. Roof and all of my wonderful high school teachers. I'm sorry you had to read my bad writing 5 times because there are several friends submitting it. But also importantly, I spent a lot of time on the website Board Game Geek, which is one of the things that really separates the board game universe from the video game universe.
For sure.
Especially, this may not be as true at this particular moment, but certainly from the year 2000 to the year, let's say 2018, it must be 80% of the discourse around certain kinds of games was happening on one site, one set of 4. If you had a question about a special move in a Euro game, or you wanted to get into an argument about strategy, you kind of gravitated to one particular place. And maybe it's not quite as hegemonic as it used to be, but that is where I hung out digitally. I think sometimes people talk about the Something Awful forums or other places in the video game space, but for me, it's like the BGG forums forced me to try to articulate my feelings about games. And then as a kind of punk, 17-year-old, 18-year-old, whatever, I'm getting into arguments with people who are much smarter than me, many of them who are in the latter stages of their career. And they're coming from all walks of life, and you're just both people who happen to think they found a broken strategy in Power Grid, and you're going to sort through that, on a forum page. So the anonymity, helps quite a bit. Being in those arguments about games and thinking about what games can and can't do, I started to articulate something like a design language, or maybe it was just taste. Maybe I was just coming to articulate my own taste, and then when I went to design things, I would try to build something that could match up to that taste. And so, the reason I started doing design diaries when I was working on Root, and they were done for a very simple reason, which is Root was built incredibly quickly because the studio was in a place of crisis when I first joined. We needed to do something. We had one game, Vast, the Crystal Caverns, this asymmetric adventure game that had done pretty well, and the studio needed to do something. And I wanted to make myself as useful as possible, right? That's the only advice I ever give to young creatives is just become indispensable in whatever organization you can find your way into. And we needed to put a project on crowdfunding, and I had notes for a strategy game, which became Root, that combined with some internal premise that Patrick had written. And we had this game that was about 6 weeks old, and it had a lot of spirit to it, but it was not done. And I wanted to communicate to our backers that we were going to really finish this thing, and it was going to live up to our ambitions for it. And the only way I knew how to do that was to just write a lot. And so for, every week for the weeks leading up to that campaign, and then during that campaign and after that campaign, I was writing these little 1,000-word essays about Foucault and biopolitics and how that informs the way the deck works in Root, or just and sometimes in these entries I wouldn't really be talking about the game at all, or sometimes I'd be talking about things about the game that weren't working, and those writing sessions helped me they helped me improve my own design process. And people also started to see, I'm going to call it my broad approach to games. And the thing that you almost certainly read during this is at the same time as I was working on Root, my game John Company was coming out. And I had written this longer design diary about the Python scripts that I had used to help build John Company.
Right.
And that was, history games are odd, especially the kind of, if you're building an open, I'm going to call it a framework, or something more like a simulationist game, you can't test all the permutations. There's just, and especially if the game is to some degree procedurally generated, there's just no way any testing regime is going to teach you anything about the game. But you can use something like a Python script to get the data you might need. And so, basically the event system in John Company is essentially a very lavishly articulated Markov chain. It's really not anything that fancy, but it was sufficiently complex that, and it was mostly designed by feel, right? So I'm like, putting these little events in and these little if thens. But I'm not, balancing it against any hard data, although there was a little bit of that in a different part of the design.
Are you more just like sort of checking edge cases to be like, okay, I need to make sure that if someone draws 4 times, they're not going to, I don't want to go off the deep end with this too quickly and talk about like state and tracking state and this type of thing. But when you're doing it at the front, you're not using it as a generative model to produce content for the game. You are using it as like let me imagine that I have these values that exist as a player and I do X, Y, Z.
It's like a validation fundamentally.
Right.
I'm like looking for the green check. Although it's worth underlining that I didn't know what I was doing. So what I did know is that I had a complex event system and that I wanted a version of India that felt like real, it felt plausible, and that I could use this complex event system to generate it. What I didn't know was how to even like handle that. So I remember I was TAing for this class when I worked at the University of Texas, and it was a class I had TA'd before, and I spent most of my time in the very back of a large lecture hall working on this Python script. And I got it done, and I had fully like put the game inside of this Python script. And I am not a good programmer. Whenever I have to build anything in Python, I have to like reteach myself Python because it's been sufficiently long.
Same, honestly.
Well, and I do understand how it works at like a basic level. I mean, not at a basic level, but I understand like, what object-oriented programming is. I grew up making all sorts of programs, but just syntax that doesn't stick in my brain, whatever. I built this thing and I ran it, and it did what any good model should do, which is it spat out like a waterfall of numbers at me. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I had built a program that was very good at spitting out numbers, but I hadn't really built a program that could sort through those numbers in any way that was meaningful. And I felt like I was at this moment where I thought that all I needed to do was like build the model, and then I'll like kind of understand it just by looking at the numbers. And then when I got the numbers, I thought, oh, I don't have any heuristics. This is just like static. I like built like a static generating machine. And so then I had to build like this other script that could sort through the numbers and say like, okay, I'm going to define some paradigms. What's the likelihood of these paradigms happening? What's the likelihood of these things happening in this relationship or in this time frame? And it was.
Are you thinking about like in terms of outcomes? I guess I don't know if this is like fully testing state or is testing sort of like permutations. But is there any part of this that is also thinking about the player who is encountering these things? Like maybe a situation where a player draws negative cards 4 times in a row, like sort of works per the math, but that is not necessarily like. Are you sort of tracking like perceived player sentiment as a way to see what routes are dead ends or something? Or is it just literally validating state?
So at first it was just validating state. That was all I was doing. And then when I realized as the game became more interactive, so basically what I was looking at was I have a model for how India behaves in the 18th century. And it's a little cartoonish, but like it's that is games are a cartoonish medium. Even the most serious game is always
See, shut up and sit down's video about John Company.
Yeah. Sorry. We're always painting in like bright cell shaded color. I don't, it's just, there's always something very, kind of cartoonish about how we work. And I just think it's important to remember that like, it's a pantomime. So I was trying to generate an India that was plausible. So I was asking myself questions like, okay, what is the chance in the early part of the 18th century that the Mughal Empire suffers a internal rebellion, something like what would become like the birth of the Maharathan Confederacy. I know what that means in the game. It means that one province in India is revolting against another one that has a kind of sovereignty over it. Cool. I've built those game terms, and I'm looking at the record and I'm thinking about likelihood, and ultimately I'm spitting out some kind of percentage, and it's a vibe-based percentage. It is a percentage informed by my understanding of history. And in the first edition of John Company, I'm like, I think there is like a 60% chance, let's say, that's going to happen. Okay, so that happens. Now that changes the political character of India. Now, what are now the most likely events that are going to happen that are going to be sort of like downstream from that? And this is the Markov chain. And my initial numbers were just about understanding what are the types of Indias this game can produce. And if it produces in India, which my heuristic might call like warring states India, what led to that? How long did it take? What's the incidence of that happening? And then I was also tracking this other thing, which is as the political landscape in India shifts, so too does the profit that might be derived from the continent by the players, because the players are playing the East India Company, they're trying to trade. If the provinces are rebelling against each other, they're going to be falling into depressions. They're going to be closing their orders in the parlance of second edition John Company, and there's going to be less profit for the company to exact. And so I got the sort of second bit of data, which is like, well, how much money is there in India based on these political environments? When does it swing up? When does it swing down? And then as I got further into the project, and as the game started giving players more options, I realized like, oh, in a world where India is shut off, the company is going to attempt to take some action to sort of break these things up. And this is where the player input was introduced. And the idea was like, I mean, the way I had to think of it, because I wasn't that sophisticated about it, was there were different paradigms for how strong or weak a company might be. And there were different situations where they would be more likely to take certain actions. So if India is fully closed up, but the company is strong, they're going to try forcing it open. And I was kind of building a little hydraulic system. And then I could go in and say like, okay, in a 3-player game, there are going to be these like player archetypes. In a 5-player game, there are going to be these player archetypes. Let's randomly fill the table with these player archetypes. Let's then put them as actors, see how they might tilt the company one way or another. What is funny about this to me is it's incredibly non-rigorous. Because I mean, I'm just kind of guessing. I'm just kind of imagining, well, I think this could happen, so I want to make sure that is accounted for in some way in the model. But I don't have any like specific way of testing it, although my desire for certain things to happen what was coming from, soft data from playtests and things like that. And the result, though, of the whole thing is that John Company has this incredibly flexible event system where really, really wild things can happen. Every game of John Company, and this is true of both editions, can really go sideways. And when you're playing it, one of my favorite parts about the design is India is inscrutable to you, as it should be. Like, you've got your little boat off Calcutta, and you might think, I have no idea what's going on there. But players get better. They can read the tea leaves a little bit. They start to understand the different sorts of gambits that they're making. And then the whole kind of world comes alive. That's only happening because I felt like the Python script was allowing me to paint a really big mural and operate at a scale that I wouldn't have been able to work at just sitting at my desk rolling dice.
Well, it's like I think about there's a really great article that a professional poker player wrote probably 6 months ago, maybe, about like, how do you know if you're good at poker? And specifically because like it's sort of very hard to know if you're good at poker because it's so luck based. And like, if you imagine sort of like imagine like a line that goes from the bottom left of a graph to the top right of a graph. And that's like 50% performance over time or something. You basically, you win half your games, you lose half your games. Better players might have a slightly increased slope such that over time they start to maybe win 60% and lose 40%. But because poker is so luck-based, it's sort of very hard to know in a given moment, like where you are on this curve of being good at poker. And I think that board games have a very similar issue where like it's sort of hard to not only like validate a design like you're talking about, but even know what performance looks like in the scope of a game, because the sort of sample size in which you might experience its mechanics can be so like effectively small. And like, just to steal some of your own words that I've heard you say, I know that with your designs you tend to, quote, swing for the fences, where you're like, you kind of approach each game as if it might be your last game, meaning that you tend to stuff them with a lot of things that are like very possible that people just like don't encounter over the course of, 10, 15, 20 plays. And so it's interesting to hear this kind of design validated where it's like, well, you're not going to play John Company 100 times in your lifetime, but you might play it 5 times. And I can actually make sure that if you play it 5 times, or if you play it 2 times, that the paths that you will chart through there will be interesting in terms of the state they provoke, instead of just being something kind of like, rote or whatever. The other flip side of this, right, is like, well, is what you're doing kind of worth it? And it's like, well, John Company is well rated, so like maybe.
Right, sure.
But also that like towards the way the design functions, you're kind of like, it allows you to sort of do what this poker player talks about, which is that the way to actually tell if you're good at poker is to not only just play poker, but to like stake in other people's poker games, where if you're able to recognize people who are good at poker and you put money on those people and pay their entry fees, you can actually start to prove you're good at poker because you understand what good poker play looks like and are able to, do 200 matches a day versus, 10 or 15 if you're playing. And you're kind of simulating some of that to say like, okay, well, over the span of, 10,000 John Company games, like what are the actual interesting routes here and sort of the desired state that can happen, versus like, if you're just doing like vibes-based stuff and you're like rolling dice, like, yeah, maybe you end up being on the right side of the bell curve such that the design kind of works for 3 plays, but then it falls apart after 4th. It sounds like you're kind of doing a lot of that work to make sure that everyone's starting at play like 150, versus starting really at the first play. Because you're making it be like, well, I know that if I have this card in the game, it's always going to make person go down this like less desirable path. So if I take this out, I actually increase the probability of these other things coming out. Yeah, it's interesting.
I'm interested too. Go ahead. Gosh, there's so much. There's so much to talk about.
We're not even talking about Rue yet. We're just still on John Company.
Yeah, we're still talking about John Company. All right. You know what? Actually, we're going to use the whole night. So it is funny because I do feel like when I'm working on a design, I don't spend any time. That's not true. I spend some time on this, but it is less important to me that someone have a good first game, because I just think trying to optimize any game system for the experience of a first play is just a fool's errand. Like you are.
And well, to be clear, you guys actually do this, but you don't do it through optimizing the gameplay systems. You suggest starting board states.
Correct. I select, yeah. So there are scenarios. We sometimes write tutorials. There's an apparatus around the game, but it's not in the game because I think the first time you play chess, you probably lose badly and it wasn't fun. I mean that to me that's not chess. That is the experience of learning something. And it's actually one of my favorite things about games is trying to figure a game out. And I'm not a very good game player generally. I lose a lot. I think there are games that I care about. Like I will if we want to have a 1-hour StarCraft discussion in the middle of this podcast, that's fine. I have a lot of opinions about like high tier, like Zerg strategy.
Great.
But
easily defeated by Marine Marauder Medevac.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, I'm just like, they just patched it. And my brother and I had like a half an hour conversation about like a Medevac adjustment.
We're going back.
Anyway, recently it occurred to me that I had been taught backgammon when I was a kid, and I thought it was sort of a dumb game that didn't make sense. I was like, you roll dice, someone wins. I don't know. It's like I had the most unserious thoughts about backgammon. And every once in a while someone's like, oh, you play the doubling cube, it's better. I'm like, yeah, you bet on anything, it makes it more interesting. But like backgammon, I don't know, it's nothing. And then I was at a shop in Italy, and they had these very fancy backgammon sets. And I was like, wow, some people spend a lot of money on backgammon. And I'm like, I wonder if you're just like, I wonder if you could get into backgammon. I wonder if you'd be good at backgammon. And so I kind of like learned backgammon. I taught it to my son, and I taught it to my wife, and we started playing backgammon. And the kind of unspoken rule of our backgammon playing was, don't read about it. Let's like see if we can derive good strategy from like first principles when it comes to backgammon. And we did that for basically a year. And at the end of the year, I was like, let's like watch a YouTube video on like how to play backgammon well. And it was fascinating because there were things that we definitely got right. And there are other things that like were not mentioned in these backgammon videos, which suggests that we were wrong. But I love games that feel open. I love the experience. If I play a game for the first time and I get walloped or something doesn't make sense, it's siren song. Because I feel like the best games are the games that operate like on the edge of our cognition. They're like you can almost grab them, you can like almost fully understand, how they work, and then you see something that just kind of like unsettles your whole thinking about what was actually important in the game. That to me is like one of the most magical things about the form. I mean, it's like, a novel that you love, realizing that it might be about something else.
Yeah, but I think you do still want to have a kind of a sniff, right? In that first or second play where it's like there's a hook to understand. Like I think that's, I don't want to debate you with design all night, but we could. But I think that's like an interesting part of board games where, like, unless you're the kind of player that reads all the rules and looks at all the cards, the actual like possibility space of the board game cannot necessarily even come into focus after a first or second play, where it can feel like you're playing like Life of Pi or something, and it turns out you're in the middle of like World War II, and you're like, oh, like,
yeah,
I mean, this is a board game, but like something like playing Inish and kind of understanding what's possible with Epic Tale cards, which are these kind of like, seismic world-changing actions that changes how you reason about the game when they come out. But if you're not anticipating that they exist, then like it can blow up your strategy and feel kind of really bad in a way where you're like, well, okay, I guess that's bad. And then so, bringing a player back after that can be difficult. But that's game design.
Yeah,
I want to move on from John Company for a second, because I'm interested. Like, I don't know if like you've been burying the lead here, but correct me if I'm wrong. But this process that you've done with John Company of actually trying to balance it from like a maths perspective is not actually something you do anymore, or maybe you haven't even done it since you've done John Company. Like, did you carry any of this sort of practice towards Root when you started that?
Not really. I mean, Root. So I often say that when I'm working on, I don't know often. What do I mean? I don't often say this. This is like, I have said this before, and it's true still. I often feel like when design is usually the process of getting backed into a corner, and when I and I'll use the example of Root's combat system, which a lot of people love. It's like their favorite combat system in board games, which I can explain for the podcast in like 3 seconds. The attacker rolls 2 dice that are numbered from 0 to 3. They're 4-sided die essentially, and does hits equal to the higher number, and the defender does hits equal to the lower number. And it's fast, and it's cute, and it generates a lot of little stories where it's possible that, and then the other rule is you can't do more hits than you have pieces. So, a heroic attacker can go in and get lucky against a big force. Upsets can happen, all sorts of things. It's a little clever piece of design that I never felt clever about, because when I was working on it, I basically had a list of scenarios that I wanted to occur in combat, and I also had a bias towards the attacker that I wanted to exist. That could be read from those scenarios. And the dice system was the only system that I could come up with that fulfilled all the criteria. And Root is filled with little things like that. I mean, it is a laundry list of last resorts, of little pieces of design. But it was the first part I worked on where I didn't feel like the lessons that I had learned from John Company or from Traffic, or a lot of the early games, which did have a lot of like coding in them, just in terms of testing specific systems, I don't think any of them helped when it came to Root. Instead, they kind of like floated in the background. And I remember asking myself, like, is there a way I could model, I don't think I was able to model anything more complicated than figuring out the probability of certain cards coming in at certain times. Like how the original deck in Root has some very dramatic crafted card abilities that players have to plan in order to build. And I did like run through some probability modeling to just figure out, like, could I hedge this? Like, if one of those cards is going to cause them to win the game, to what degree can they like squat on the right parts of the map and get that to trigger? And I remember doing that analysis, and at the end of the analysis being like, well, it seems like it is possible. But like the level of incidence isn't high enough that I'm worried about it. And I also don't feel like it necessarily cracked any particular code. But I still use techniques like that from time to time. I mean, jumping way ahead to Arcs. Arcs has a dice-based combat system. And those dice were designed with the help of a tool, I think it's called MDie, that was designed by Jeff Engelstein, who's a great Great designer and a great advocate for talking about design. Most people know him for his time hosting the Ludology podcast, but he designed a tool where you could, it's a visual programming language where you can easily design different styles of dice with different rules, and then very quickly get probabilities and standard deviations and all sorts of fun charts. And I used that to build the ARCS dice because I knew what I wanted those curves to look like. And I sculpted them like kind of backwards. Like I remember I have it on a piece of paper somewhere. I drew these like little curves for different combat scenarios. And I was like, okay, now what should the dice faces look like? And what should the combat rules be? And it was just about a week and a half or 2 weeks of just, plunking in numbers, running it, seeing it, sculpting it a little bit. And then eventually, every once in a while, we would play a game. But that combat system was letting me fight a lot more battles a lot more quickly.
Right.
Just from kind of zooming out. So I always use it as a little bit of a tool. But I think the main thing that happened is the more I worked in design, the more I got interested in what I might like. I don't really have a coherent term for it because I feel like I'm still in the middle of sort of theorizing this, but something like player-driven procedural generation, where so Oath. I want to go to that Rogue conference someday and give a talk about Oath, because Oath
Roguelike Celebration.
Yes, which I love. I love watching those talks, and I always mean to submit a paper, and I never manage to. It's a busy time of year for me, but I really want to talk about Oath and procedural generation and roguelikes because I was playing a lot of roguelikes when I was working on Oath, and I was thinking a lot about how roguelikes generate their worlds. And the kind of core conceit of Oath is, and the way I sell Oath when I'm working at a convention is Oath is a game that remembers how it was played. And it's a game where every beginning state is also an end state. So when you get to the end of a game, you can start a game on that same game state with some cleanup. And the trick of the game is that there is a procedurally generated world that is being created where every game is kind of one generation, but the players are the thing procedurally generating it.
Right.
And so someone asked me like, does Oath have a backstory? And I'm like, no, I'm using you to make the backstory because I don't have a way to do it without actual human minds. I mean, that's these cardboard computers, they all have the same microprocessor, and it's and so in order to build that, I found myself when I was working on Oath thinking a lot about data. I mean, so I'll give a very sort of simple, strange way I was running into it. So Oath has a world map, and the world map in Oath is essentially it's sort of like a two-dimensional array, I guess. Like it's a line. So Oath's map is a line, and then at different spots in the line there might be things attached to each like kind of node. And the line uses two classes of data, essentially like an object and a container. So it's a line of containers, and then the containers might have a number of objects in them. And the reason why Oath's map is like this is because I can collapse it into a one-dimensional array. Everybody goes in the container, and then I can collapse the containers in a stack. And so it allows players to like generate this world and store it very easily. And then that forced me to think about like, well, what are the bits of information? What is the characteristic of the essential like information unit of the game? And that was the card. And then the whole design of the game was about answering the questions of what are the possible characteristics of cards? How many cards exist in the system? How much data can the players hold in their heads as they're collectively building this world? And then how easily can I store the world when the players aren't playing it? And because I need players in that process, I can't easily model it the way I might be able to model something like an event table.
Well, also, like, I think specifically because in something like Oath, you are like, I don't know, I wouldn't say if you're on the record about this, but like a lot of I guess you are on the record about being sort of, I wouldn't say you're pro king making, this concept of like basically at the end of board games, it can get to this weird situation where like everybody's one turn away from winning. So the game drags on twice as long because everyone's trying to make themselves win, not someone else. You're sort of like, take the narratively interesting option, like let this person win and play another game. And I think that mentality is threaded out through Oath, where because the game sort of remembers, so to speak, and there's like literally a ledger of history, you make players, or like you're very much showing players a way to play that is more about narrative satisfaction than intrinsic or extrinsic reward associated with winning, right? You're like, oh, okay, well, I can know that if there's a warrior player and they have a magic sword, that they do more damage, and you could like write a program to sort of model how much damage they can do. But it's very hard to account for like how that person's, dinner tasted, and maybe they're feeling a little off, and they're, maybe they had their last game they played, this character sort of made an appearance, and, they had a bad time or something. And so they actually don't want to be aggressive with this character that would sort of be a shoo-in for some sort of conquest. And so they will act suboptimally, so to speak, but in a way that is narratively satisfying to make the story of the game being played be compelling. And that's like, you can't really model that, like you can assume that it's possible that it can happen, but it's hard to then game out state in that way. Like John Company, everyone's trying to do the same thing, right? Like everyone wants to have a house back in London together. Whereas I'm like, a player can come with a whole host of what they want out of a given game. That's not just like, I want to win, like you would in chess.
Right. Because so this is why like Oath is a game that is like less about, modeling, although I mean, all games are models to a degree, but it's actually sort of about data structure. Like it's about what is the game allowing itself to even remember? Because most games don't remember anything. And in the context, I mean, one thing that I found really interesting when I started getting more interested in board games, and I was kind of thinking about, should I play in a board game tournament or like, do whatever the next tier of silly board game thing that I could think of. I remember learning as a kid that most tournaments, you're just scoring wins and losses. Like there's no other point system. It's like, no, it's a simple ELO system. It's like, it's a win, there's a loss, a draw maybe. But like they don't care really how many pieces you're taking on the board and all that stuff. Because ultimately the game is creating like just kind of one little output. And one of the things that I'm really happy about with Oath is Oath said like, okay, well, if that's one, byte of information, I'm making a bad digital metaphor here. Like what happens when we give the output a kilobyte? And then if it's going to be that big, how would you structure it? Like, it can remember different kinds of things. And so Oath does this funny trick, which is it remembers almost nothing about the players, but it remembers everything about the world. Like the world is the only thing that gets saved in a game of Oath. And then, I had to kind of go through this sort of very long process to figure out what sorts of data should even be saved, and actually how many possible colors should the players even be allowed to paint in when they were building an Oath. And this is something that I think I did a pretty good job with, and I'm happy with, but I wasn't happy enough that I wanted to let it be. It's like why I'm still working on Oath. I mean, that's all I did today was work on Oath because we're designing an expansion, and the expansion is really funny because I think some people are going to get it and they're going to be like a little shocked and appalled because it's sort of a reimagining of how the game works. But for me, it doesn't feel...
Is it more of an adventure game?
It is more of an adventure game. It's more of like an open world game. It remembers a lot more. It remembers things about the players. But for me, it's the experience of going from a 2 megabyte stick and putting the second 2 megabyte stick in my 386. And now I've got 4 megabytes of RAM. And so there's all this stuff that is interesting, is part of the story of Oath, that the game can like now remember. Players have these like lineages and characteristics. And then the actual apparatus of the game itself, the system of play, can be modified over the course of several games. So like maybe you change like how movement works and the game has a way to remember, okay, we are now using like the alternate movement system because that thing has shifted. And even though it is in some ways radically different from base Oath, to me it just feels like a very obvious like extension of the game's core capability, as opposed to just a content expansion.
Right.
To just saying like, yep, there's another world now or whatever.
I remember seeing like some tweet forever ago about someone, I don't remember how I saw this, but like they must have tagged you or Leader and like one of you guys retweeted it or something. But there was like someone had made like a traveling bard character, and you were like, oh my gosh, I don't know if you said you didn't know that could happen, but you're like, it's so great that this can happen. And you contrast that with like, no one takes a picture of the map in Oath and posts it on Twitter to be like, check out this map I generated.
Right.
Like maybe one person does because it's like some weird edge case and it's like hard to get from, point A to B or whatever. Like the hinterland is now like sequestered off, but like that character that kind of evolves as part of that story is so much what people start to identify with. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's surprising to me that not a lot of other people are doing this in board games. I mean, I think like Earthborn Rangers is doing it.
Yeah.
Sleeping Gods is sort of doing it.
To me,
Old King's Crown is like getting there, but it's like, it's surprising that it seems like an unexplored dimension. Cause like Oath, especially even more so than Root or Arcs, is like, it exists on this sort of boundary line between role-playing game and board game in a way that I think a lot of board games right now are more like, is it a board game or a video game? And you're sort of straddling this like other dichotomy in this really interesting way where like it's also we're saying like none of the games that you've made so far use like a digital aid at all. Like they're very much board games. They're board games in the sort of 70 cents. It's cardboard on paper. Although I do have a neoprene mat for Oath, but largely right there you're working in a tabletop-y space, but you're increasingly moving towards like. I mean, I think Arc speaks to this, like, even more explicitly with the concept of its campaign game, but like the idea of just winning seems to be much less of a priority for you, which is not unsurprising coming from historical games where like no one wins or loses.
Right.
History just moves on.
Well, there's a funny, I love going to historical gaming conventions because I feel a much stronger sense of kinship with people who work in historical game design than any other single group of designers. And one thing that is amazing is like you will play a battle or something and no one really cares who's winning. I mean, you obviously care. Right. You're obviously invested. But to me, the notion of balance, at least in the circles I'm in, is not that interesting. It's more interesting to think about the fidelity of model, what sorts of like you always need abstractions. Where are you putting your abstractions? And then because the hope is the game will ultimately be as interesting as the historical event which caused you to want to make the game. And if you can do that, then the balance kind of take care of itself because the core situation was what was interesting. I mean, I feel so strange about the concept of winning in games because I do think it's really important. A player's desire to win a game, to fulfill the victory condition, it's almost like the watch spring, like the mainspring in a watch. It is the thing that is creating all of the tension in the game. Mm-hmm. And so I don't ever really want to go to a game and just say like, yeah, it's vibes, don't worry about winning, just kind of explore it. I do want players to win. I want there to be consequences for actions. And winning is like a way of structuring those consequences. And actually, it's interesting. In Oath, the winner gets so much control over the shape of the world that it actually kind of strangles other parts of the games unintentionally. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time working through on the expansion, there's still a lot of work to be done, is just giving the players who didn't win other things to care about. Sure. So, you might not have won, but because you were leading the weird cult, you can change one of the rules of the game. So you can look at a game state and like kind of point at the places where your lineage might have like executed some agency, even if you weren't necessarily winning. There's this amazing thing that happens I think when you're playing a game where when you're playing to win and everybody it's almost like the recognition of stakes. Like we're all sitting down to a game. We've all decided that we're going to try to win. And the reason why we've decided that is because that is allowing us to care about the game. So the winning is important because it creates an emotional stake. It like creates the investment.
Mm-hmm.
My wife hates chess because she says the problem with playing chess is that you're never just playing chess. There's always like, who's smarter? Who knows more about chess?
Right.
Who's cleverer? Or who's seen that movie? Who's read that book? It's always like this contest, always fraught. But I think, when you sit down to play a game and everyone cares about winning, they're anteing their care. But once the ante's on the table, you can start like using that as a dramatic object, because I could betray someone and all of that care is now, I'm pushing it from one side of the table to another. It can be a tremendously like resonant, dramatic move that fits completely with the story of the game. And that's only happening because we cared about winning. So there's like a core paradox here. When we were playtesting Oath, we had our graphic designer was fantastic at Oath, and she had won 3 or 4 games of Oath in a row. And one of our developers had weaseled his way into her empire as a citizen, and she had this sprawling empire, and through like a very lucky turn of events, this little weasel was going to ascend to the throne and take control of everything. And at the last turn, the graphic designer who'd been winning all these games, she backed like essentially a revolutionary who toppled her own government out of spite. And it was a perfect ending to that like 3 or 4 game saga that was like, yeah, you know what? I dislike you so much in this game that I would rather everything I built fall apart than see you have it. And that only happened because everyone was caring so much about winning. And so there is a contradiction there, but to me, the care and the investment is the thing.
I want to go back to something you said earlier that I sort of like, I balked against it when you said it, but as we're talking now, I think I see more of what it is, which is this idea of the games that you/leader make kind of operating in this like weird niche of like the types of things that people like to play. And I was like, no, you guys make like hobby board games. People play the stuff in, whatever, they're going to play Concordia next or, whatever, Undaunted or something. But I do think you are on to something with that, which is like, because the situation you're describing is not necessarily what you would expect from just your average game table. Like I know people specifically in the table that I've typically play with that like don't like your designs because they're like, well, like I know that like they like to win. Like they like that sort of contract between a game is a competition between 4 people. There will be a winner and a loser. Like there's not that sort of appetite there. And so it is an interesting dimension of this where it's like your games are sort of niche in this way where they are niche from the rest of hobby board gaming, but as evidenced by like the, meteoric success of something like Root, it is itself actually found an audience that has sort of been there the whole time that no one's been looking at, which is like people that want something, slightly different, something that like is fun and it's compelling to play, but it doesn't have to just be about like who wins or loses because, it's the story we told along the way. It's like, it's how the Marquis fell or how the Erie, went into decline at the perfect time that the Vagabond was able to come and stab them or something. And it's like, that feels like a fun story to recall compared to like, we played like Gugong recently and it's like, oh, I won Gugong. It's like, okay, cool. I put the most pieces on the board. It's not, There's not a lot of a story there. It's like, I did the mechanics the best. And there's a lot of games that are like that, but you're sort of operating in this different register. And it's proven to be like both lucrative in terms of sort of the success of your games, but also in terms of the possible things you can bring to that because so much of it does tend to be so new. And I think it is also nice that you have the ability to then, test that out on the span of years versus, 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Every time.
Well, I mean, when Root came out, there was this moment where so back that year, Gen Con in 2018, they didn't really have a lot of tables for play. And there was this moment where I was walking around in the concourse, like towards the hotel, and I saw all these people playing Root on the floor. And in that moment, I was like, look at all these people like throwing dice and like yelling and like kind of like pushing each other over. They're all sitting cross-legged, so it's like a little bit of like a camp atmosphere. And I thought, there's always like one game that does really well that kind of like breaks through, and board gaming tends to have like the 3 games that do really well each year and then kind of everyone else. And I just couldn't believe it was the sort of game I liked. Like I almost took like the fact that I had made it was weirdly incidental in that moment, because it's such a kind of older school of design. Like, you know, when you describe the old school tabletop approach, like a game from the 70s, I glowed a little, because that's, you know, even though my designs aren't quite like a game from the 70s in some ways, but they are like Eon Games, who made, you know, they made Dune and Borderlands and this amazing game called Darklands. Darkover, a game that has a combat mechanism of a staring contest. But it's this notion that like we are sitting down to play a game together, and play is sort of a rough and tumble dramatic exercise. There's always like a theatrical bent to it. And in the context of when I started designing and publishing games, that was really deeply out of fashion. And I think I mean, you were like sort of like, you weren't like right at like board game renaissance peak, but it's like you're coming off of a board game hobby group that's really into like Terra Mystica. Yes.
Or like, you know, strategy games that are like geared towards winning. Like Euro games are sort of ascendant this time. Like Catan gets sort of close, but that's in sort of its own little corner of the market. But yeah, like your Root was not an obvious shoe in for one of the most successful board games of the past decade.
And I just felt like it was funny. I encountered a designer very early on at Leader who was very well known in the industry. And I was at a show, and I think Root hadn't come out yet. And I was at a show, and he was kind of holding court and talking to younger designers, and I was just sort of listening. And he was kind of spewing out like design best practices. And I found myself getting so agitated, because it was all about like maximizing the fun and like get rid of the feel bads and just all of these sort of like design platitudes that create a certain kind of experience that I just felt like was everywhere in the design. I mean, I often call them like track Euros, like Euros where all of your resources are arranged on this track that you're going to advance on the track and then get some of those resources. One of our staff developers played Jamie Stegmeier's Tapestry, and I asked him how it was, and he said, Jamie took all of the actions that you'll ever take in a Civilization game, and he just put them in a row. And you just walk on the row and you take the actions. And he's like, it's kind of relaxing, but he's also like, I don't really know what I just did, you know, with my time. And that might be a little ungenerous to Tapestry, but I mean, I do think it is part of like it's part of what one of the ways tabletop games can be and how they manifest in this moment. And the thing that is like wonderful about crowdfunding and about the nature of the studio is we found out like actually there are a lot of people who like a different style of game, and they are happy to fund it. It's like such a thing. Like, I think it's easy to like just from like the video game perspective, it's very easy for people to sort of see video games as like a sort of fixed audience size. But I think it's calcified in this way where like it is crazy to watch things that are from the perspective of someone who's into video games seem experimental actually be so much bigger than sort of what would look like a sort of more traditional peer. Like I think about something like Donut County or like Untitled Goose Game. Like those are like weird games from like conventional wisdom about how you make a game. Like those are strange things that are like, they were like incredibly successful, but not with like all the people that go to like PAX or whatever. Right. Like it was successful because it was like people who don't play games, who like see a lot of that stuff. And they're like, no, like I don't want to play, Puerto Rico or something. Right. They're like, this seems kind of interesting in this other different way. And like, it's able to actually sort of prove out this other dimension where you're like, oh, like what seems experimental to us is actually exactly what a larger audience wants.
And so it's never like Call of Duty 25 is never going to pierce that other audience.
Right.
Because it's already sort of got saturation around people who are interested in that type of thing.
Well,
Stuff that is weirder will find those people. And I think Root is like a great example of that, where you're like, yeah, like you're saying, you're like, oh, like, there was a time when every hobby person played Root because that was like the hot thing to play. But like the game has been successful much beyond that. So it's, it's far beyond just people who are into hobby board gaming continue to like and play Root. It's that Root has proved out its own, people, so to speak.
Well, whenever we hire a new staff member at Leader Games, there's always this moment, usually in the hiring process, but sometimes after they've started, where I take them into my office and I like roll up a little whiteboard. And I'm like, all right, here's a bell curve. All games that we ever produce their sales kind of like you can arrange in a normal distribution. Trouble with Root is that we don't know where we are on the bell curve. Like we get such mixed signals about it. It consistently like outperforms any metric that we have, but we're like not really seeing those sales reflected in something like the BGG user owners stats anymore. I mean, we used to really see them there. Or, as another example, Pax Pamir is kind of the same way. I mean, when I was working on that game, I got all these weird messages about people saying like, why are you making a game about 1820s Afghanistan? This theme is not going to go anywhere. You're never going to be able to shop it to a publisher. And the thing that I was thinking about was like, well, one, I am interested in it and I want to make it. And I'm like less interested in the game doing well. I think I have become, as a designer, much more interested in games doing well because, I don't know, there are families involved. There's a whole little business that I want to make sure can thrive on the long term. But especially when I was working on Pamir, I'm like, I want to make my weird Afghanistan game. I don't really care. But I also knew that there was a body of historical gamers like me who wanted games on weird subjects. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the Pamir sales, for a while, the Pamir sales cleaved very closely to the BGG ownership stats. And now they've started going off in their own direction, where we're continuing to sell the game, but we're not seeing people register on BGG, which means we're seeing it sold to other places. And it's just kind of finding its own little life. Mm-hmm. I had a friend who, I'm going to butcher this story, unfortunately, but he was like in the middle of the desert at this gas station, or he was at like a coffee shop, and he was like talking to this guy who just kind of looked like, I don't know, he described as like a hobo or something, right? Just like kind of hanging out, bedraggled. And the guy was like, oh, what are you working on? The guy's like, I'm working on a board game. I work for a board game company. And the guy was like, oh yeah. I'm playing this game about Afghanistan. And like that guy in the desert, he was playing Pax Pamir. And it's just like, you kind of never know where they're gonna find. I mean, it's always been really important to me that when we are leading projects at the studio, that the projects always have like some kind of urgency, and that also we feel like we are able to give them resources so they can actually be properly finished. Mm-hmm. And this is where I am just so privileged. I mean, this was the kind of thing when I was rambling in my bad introduction. What I was really trying to say is, I'm the creative director at Leader Games. I'm one of the few folks that I know who is fortunate enough to do this full time. But what's really crazy about the situation is that because of the nature of our audience and the nature of our work and our past success, we are able to make extremely irresponsible business decisions about funding projects that, and because of our audience's faith, we can hedge these like very huge bets because the company doesn't have any debt. And, and we can go into a project and I could say, okay, Patrick, I would like to spend 3 years designing a like choose your own adventure space campaign game. And, I remember, and I was like, Patrick, the core idea, I mean, I remember like the very early pitch sessions for ARCs is I was like, I think the 4X framework is a bad framework for space games because Luke Skywalker doesn't defeat Darth Vader because he researches like a 10% efficiency improvement on his X-Wing. There's like got to be something more dramatic to that story. So like what happens if you build a science fiction game that's actually thinking about the sinews of science fiction instead of some weird like early 90s memory of playing Masters of Orion. And then the second thing is I want the game to be all about having bad luck because stories are about protagonists who have bad luck. So the core mechanism of the game needs to have players constantly feeling like they're on the back foot. And with nothing more than that, Patrick was like, yeah, spend 6 months. Just work on that problem for a while. And that,
I remember talking like,
no, period.
I remember I used to work at like a video production studio in New York, and like we would like watch, whatever hot video was out like once or twice a week. And there was this like video people made about Pixar, to bring that up again. And it was like about how Pixar just like throws out all these stories, right? They iterate, or at least like that's their marketing speak of themselves, is that they're really great at iterating on stories. They spend so much time on a story, and they're like, after a year and a half, they'll have like a really great original story. And then I remember my like sort of stupid boss like pausing the video at the end and being like, how can we do this? And I was like, well, step one seems like we don't just spend 2 days and put out a video. Like, they're like, well, we can't change that. So, okay, go back to work. It's like, it seems like if you have that ability to sit with something for a long time and just like do the work to be like, okay, you can take a 4-month rabbit hole. Like I remember in the Oath Diaries, like, I don't know how much of this kind of ever, I think there was a lot of stuff I believe that was like in Oath for a very long time to sort of get cut near the end. Granted, at that point, the Kickstarter was like funded, but like, I remember you talking about like specific, I think it was like maybe like the way the turns worked. There was like a different system than the sort of like ends after five or 7 turns thing that was just in for a long time. And they were like, the world used to be this kind of like circle versus this line. And it's like stuff that you could just do for like, you could use it as an operating model for 6 months only to find out like, oh, it needs to be like this. That's like a different, and then being able to change that right midstream. Like most people get 2 months, maybe,
right?
If that, to then be like, oh, this is the best thing we got, and I'll fix it the next time. It's like, it's definitely like a nice position to be in, because it does like, I don't think you've like, burned the goodwill of your followers by any means yet. And I think part of that is like, you can expect that something you guys do will have that care put into it.
Well, it's one reason why at the company, we don't have like a producer role, which I don't know if it's going to be like that forever, but at least at this point, like we have a role, we have a system that basically empowers project leads fully. Like if the studio itself and the operations team and everybody and me as the creative director, if we agree with your proposal for a project and we put you on a lead, and you have a broad sense of the resources that are available to you, I want you to set your own schedule. I want you to figure that stuff out, because I don't want to introduce anything into that process that might cause you to not ask for more time if you need it. And like one of the things, I mean, so it's funny. I was working this weekend, and I had a friend of mine who does product management for a big financial company, and I was just kind of, I felt the spirit move me. I was working on the rules, and sometimes I will on the weekends I'll be on Discord and I'll just like share my screen. I'll just kind of be hanging. I'm like kind of just working in a public place. And he came on and he was like, "Why are you working? It's a weekend." And I like started talking about it. I'm like, "Well, I want to do this," and then he got very curious in how I work. He was like, "Can you do you guys do sprints? Et cetera, et cetera."
Yeah.
And he eventually, so I shared like, well, I'm like, yeah, we kind of do sprints. And I shared some of the internal documents and how we kind of structure our work. And I could tell that there was a little bit of like horror creeping in to his visage. Because and as we were talking, eventually I was like, well, it was a very fruitful conversation, because I certainly learned some things, and I have some good takeaways, some things I'm going to steal from Agile. I'm always happy to steal from a good system, but I don't like the idea of putting any more pressure on what would be called like a quote product owner to finish something too soon if it needs more time. I had dinner with some game reviewers once, and they jokingly asked me like, "Hey, Cole, like why do studios make bad games? Like there's all these bad games that came out this convention. Like how'd that happen? Don't you guys know what a good game is?" And I said, like, sometimes you can't cancel a game.
Yeah.
And so my core metric for success and stability at the company is how many games I feel like we can comfortably cancel. And so whenever we have a game do well, like Arcs has done very well, and to me, it does well so we can cancel out 3 games.
Sure.
And so those go in the like game canceling vault. And it's this very, very morbid way of thinking about our success. But I'm like, boy, we could cancel like 6 games, and we cancel games all the time. I worked on this right after Root. I designed this card game that was kind of like PUBG. Like I really liked PUBG. I was playing a lot of it and thinking about how it worked as a game. I think it's like actually the sort of the only interesting for competitive first person shooter in a long time was like the innovation to battle royale, in a way that I still don't think people like fully appreciate, like how fundamentally different and interesting that genre is.
I agree.
And so I made a card game that was like a battle royale style card game. And I worked on it for so long, and I just couldn't get it to work. And I threw it in the bin because it wasn't doing the thing I wanted it to do.
You're like, hope Arcs does well. I just canceled this one.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, our life bar is running a little
this next
low.
one be good.
Well, even Arcs. So I'll say one other thing about product management. Because the team was getting bigger, I watched a bunch of GDC talks and read a lot about video game product management. And thought, okay, I'm going to be a better manager. And we went into Arcs, and I had built my Kanban. I did all the homework I could do, and we built a version of Arcs that was the Arcs that released for the Kickstarter. And everything was on time, and no one was stressed, and all of our work units were happy, or whatever corporate jumbo nonsense people would want to say. And I played the game after the crowdfunding campaign. I'm like, I don't think this game's that good. I kind of want to start over. and so like, I just remember going in and just erasing the Kanban that I had drawn in my office, like painstakingly all the little boxes. I was like, I think this has just led me astray. And there's still there's such useful tools for certain parts of the process, but I do think like the most useful tool any artist has is their eraser. And you don't want to do anything to make that tool less useful.
I'm interested, like, this is something I wanted to talk about a bit with like Oath and Arcs to a degree. It was like kind of like that role of actually playing stuff. I know like in Oath, because it was a pandemic game, like you guys actually had sort of a disproportionately large amount of people playing Oath, maybe relative to how many people are playing Arcs now. Actually, I don't know if there's a way to quantify. I mean, I assume your Discord, but like Oath was very much a sort of like, its life was almost like a digital game for a long time with like the TTS module. And because people couldn't presumably get together and play with their friends. So like that game was largely like a game that existed on TTS for most people for the large duration of its time before it went to print. Like, was that as a sort of experience of like putting that together? Like, what was that like? Like, were you able to, coming back to this idea of data a little bit, like, was there signal from that was like useful that you could look at to like figure out balance of stuff that was like different from Arcs? Like, and I'm interested like how you didn't get that signal from Arcs earlier, even if you were following sort of a separate process, or sorry, if you were following like a discrete process.
Yeah, so
presumably you would know at that point, like, oh, well, this game is not working because this didn't work. So and so. And
so I didn't get that signal for Arcs, but it was a very purposeful. It was a purposeful deafening. So Root and Pamir were designed basically by 5 people. It was, it was a very, very small group, maybe 8 if I include like the other playtesting group that was really useful, but an incredibly small team.
Right.
And then with Oath and the pandemic, the pandemic had this interesting effect in the world of tabletop testing, because a lot of people who might have a tabletop group are really interested in game design, but unless their whole group is interested, they do not participate in game design at all. Right. Because the pandemic broke up all these groups, suddenly like little free radicals, there were all these floating playtesters, and they started to coalesce in like our Oath testing Discord, which suddenly had 150 people who seemed to have an infinite amount of time to play games of Oath. And from a kind of nitty gritty practical, like testing iterative loop element, or from the vantage point of just the game's iterative loop, usually I would publish new versions on Tuesdays or Mondays because I knew it was going to take a player all week to like read the rules, print the kit, assemble it, get their group together on Friday or Saturday. And then on Monday, I would read the new feedback, incorporate any changes, potentially put another iteration on Tuesday, whatever. Sometimes it'd be every other week. With digital games, all that work of building the kits is work that I do because it's a tabletop simulator kit. So we started pushing the kits on Thursdays and Fridays along with patch notes. And the patch notes are always like a little jokey, like, hey, this silly exploit, we like fixed it. We did this, we did that. And suddenly all the players they're very excited because all they had to do was boot up the game and then they could be playing the game. And we found that instead of testers wearing out, I mean, I used to build like a little Gantt chart of my testers because I knew they were going to exhaust themselves. And so I could kind of plan on a really good group, like giving the game 5 plays and then being done. And so I had groups that were good in the first heat, good in the second, good in the third, or whatever the segments of relay race or something. And that actually stopped with Oath. We found that like the opposite was true. That actually, as the game got closer to being done, more players were pouring into what we might think of as like early access.
Sure.
If you want to hear more about this, I'm going to give a whole GDC talk about early access, processes and tabletop with the person who helped me work on ARCs. So when it came to the management of data, we actually did pull some really interesting things. So one thing, our mod allowed people to export their worlds as a kind of long alphanumeric string of characters. I think it's like 140 characters or something, and it holds all the data of the game. And this allowed people to easily share and branch worlds, which was really neat. And then I could also look at it, and there was a website that someone built a little bit later that it just allows people to upload those strings, and you can just see all the different worlds, all the different versions of the game. And then I also wanted people to be submitting screenshots of their finished world, and I would go through and kind of like catalog them, be like, okay, that's interesting. You can kind of tell a fair bit about what happened in Oath from like the final board state. And so I would just sort of like look at that, like how much money is in the game? Why is that happening? Are there certain dynamics? And so I'm getting very soft analytics. I had originally thought I was going to get all this like very specific, these good numbers. And instead I found that my own analysis was getting like more and more qualitative. And so I had to develop a different way of processing that, of course. And then, I mean, I'll even take this farther. So Oath was a digital game, even to the degree that we would track errata for the different cards and all the different card interactions. And we had a database of that errata that we uploaded that the TTS mod could then query. And so when you hover over a card in TTS, it will, as the little drop-down menu will like pop up that's like the FAQ for that card.
Oh, interesting.
And that database is still maintained. In fact, we just overhauled it. So if you go to like cards.leadergames.com,
I saw this website. This website is awesome.
It is so good. Yeah. It is so good.
Card.leadergames.com is so cool. Anybody listening to this podcast, definitely check it out.
And it like allows you to search any card in the game. You get a scan of the card, and you also get FAQs, you get, links to the rules, all the different elements. And then every card is also like really robustly tagged. So that if you use the advanced search features, you're like, how many war bands like have this element? I mean, how many like battle plans have this element in Oath? And you're like, click, and you got them. I will say, developing the Oath expansion, I always have this website up because I'm like, okay, I think I need to adjust this game terminology. How many cards would I need to reprint?
And are you like I guess like from a sort of a data perspective, like this data is sort of like, it's more of like a baked version of the game as is now compared to like, you're not using this database. Well, maybe you are, because I know like you for a long time, I mean, at least definitely on John Company, maybe Pax as well. Like you did a lot of graphic design. I remember seeing you talk about like a lot of data merge stuff that you were doing to basically build this. And I know that, I guess, I don't know if you want to go into that a little bit and sort of how it intersects with what we're seeing on the Leader Games site, and sort of, I guess, the evolution of your approach to a lot of that.
Well, I do a ton of graphic design. Graphic design is, I mean, it kind of goes back to the thing we were talking about at the very beginning of this podcast, which is that I love how games force you to take like an abstract system and then represent it in space. And graphic design is like one of the ultimate like incarnations of that process, because you need to think about visual hierarchy and all of and sometimes it just comes down to like how much area is being spent by this idea in a Cartesian plane or something. And so when I'm working, I often use a feature in InDesign called data merge, which allows you to take a spreadsheet and then use that spreadsheet to place text and images.
Mm-hmm.
It can get more complicated than that because you can also...
Is this like standard for board games? Just like as a side thing, or is this more?
Some people use it. It's one of those things that there are no standards really. But I find that if you have a large card base, certainly if you're dealing with more than 100 cards or 200 cards, you're usually better off using data merge if you are doing a lot of big iteration on, especially so like early on in a game. If I'm designing a game that I know is going to have 200 cards, and I'm going to be iterating a lot because I'm in the early phases of development, I'm using data merge. And data merge is extremely powerful if you know how far you can take it within InDesign. So InDesign has, for instance, I'm sure there's a better program to do this, but I use InDesign because it's the industry standard. But for example, InDesign has grep queries. Do people say grep? I'm not a software person.
I say grep.
Yeah, grep. I think grep sounds better.
Yeah.
So InDesign has grep built in. And the reason, and grep is basically, and I'll butcher it here, but I'll just say it's sort of a one-line code that allows you to search things and do kind of some simple operations. What you can do, for instance, in InDesign is you can use those queries to then style things with different fonts. So I could say, hey, grep, I want you to, for this type of paragraph styling, the first sentence should always be in small caps, or the first sentence needs to be green, or whatever. Or I could say, hey, whenever you see like a caret, like a little exponent symbol, I want you to take that symbol and the next symbol and change the font. And I could have a font then that is the game's icon system.
I remember seeing you talk about this on Twitter, and I was like, this is cool. Like you made your own font that is the icon system of the game, so you can sort of address it as data versus just being sort of an opaque PNG somewhere. Right, and there's not like a lot of limits to what you can do with that. I mean, the font size can balloon if the glyphs are really big, but like you can do a lot with like effectively an icon font for the game, and you're using it to basically you position text on the card that is the icon. But and data merge allows it to be a target, whereas like I don't think data merge works usually for images.
So you can use data merge for images, but you can't have them floating in text. And like for instance, if I let's say I have a little area of a card that is going to be a cost, and so in that area I want to put 1 coin or 2 coins or 3 coins, and I want them to be centered. Well, what I would have to do is make every permutation of costs as like different PNGs, and then use data merge to place those PNGs in that frame. But data merge is speaking in like file paths. It's like, where's the PNG you want me to use, dummy? And you're like, okay, it's here. And so what happens is you develop these spreadsheets that are like utterly unreadable. Because they're just file paths, and then they may not work on other people's computers depending on how they have their file paths set up. Although Dropbox fixes a lot of those problems, and so if I look and I say, a little exponent 1 is a coin, I can now do a find replace for just those coins. You can kind of read it just offhandedly. There was a really funny consequence of this, which we realized later, which is. We used a color font. Now, most fonts are not colored. They are single color. And that's important because the way fonts are coded allows the software to determine the color of the font. You type something, you change it to blue, whatever. But color fonts, which I really wanted because the game's icons were in color, so I wanted them to be in full color. So I did all this work to find a piece of font software called Font Self, which allowed you to build these color fonts. However, color fonts have a weird lineage in like the way operating systems work, where actually they're essentially native to mobile because they're emoticons. An emoticon is like a color font, and they don't exist outside of RGB space. So when we got ready to run the very final exports of Oath, one of the things you have to do is convert everything to CMYK. And the computer we just wouldn't do it.
Just disappears.
They were like, absolutely not. You've got this weird mobile emoticon in here. We cannot render it.
Right.
And so we had to outline, we had to do this process called outlining, where you basically convert the entire font into vectors at the very last step, which makes the files utterly unqueryable. They're just horrible at the end. And so it ended up catastrophically backfiring at the 11th hour. I mean, I remember going into work for that 2-week period where the graphic designer and I, both of whom have clocked a decade in InDesign. I think I would classify both of us as a senior level graphic designers. And we were I'm deep in the postscript of a PDF being why isn't this font converting? It doesn't make any sense. And I had to learn.
You're looking at postscript. That's pretty
great. I was just trying to figure out, what was happening in these, and maybe they fixed it in the years since. So I'm gonna.
Has that evolved at all? Since, because that was for
that was for
Oath.
So the thing that happened with Oath though is at the very end of Oath, we realized that because we had switched to this digital model, we had, without really realizing it, introduced a bunch of awkwardness into the design because the digital format was doing it for players. And I was pretty unhappy about it. I mean, I was happy with how Oath turned out, but I was these are mistakes that if we were playing the game constantly in Office, we would have never made these mistakes.
It's oh, I have to, I would imagine it's oh, I have to reach across the board so much to do this thing over here that is just it sucks to do this every turn. And you're you wouldn't know that because moving your little hand in TTS is half a second. So you just grab stuff and move it around. You're not thinking about the physicality of the game at that point.
Well, and we were designing it to remove places for player input because we knew that the fewer player interrupts that were in the game, the faster certain phases could resolve. And so things about the way the Chronicle teardown happened, which we just automated in the digital version of the game. When we were doing it in person, we were this kind of sucks. This long in process. There's 13 steps. And one of the things that we changed in the expansion is now it's 6 steps and they're all interesting. And then all the chore stuff happens kind of at the beginning of the game when you choose to play again. Because players at the end of the game want to do something interesting. They don't want to set it up. So because of that, when I started working on arcs, I had a rule that I wasn't going to build a digitally playable kit of arcs for the first year of its life. And I didn't say first year, but until the game was fully realized, I wanted to only be playing the game physically. And so a lot of the early versions of arcs were not entirely handwritten, but I mean, I would take literally a deck of playing cards and root pieces and be okay, let's think about the action system. And that was work that I would have always done digitally. Fully digitally in the past. And then when it came time to do the data merge for where we would have done really elaborate data merging to build the ARCS files, ARCS was actually kind of past that point. And so we didn't actually end up having to build data merges at all for ARCS. All the ARCS cards are laid out by hand.
Sure.
Because they have there are too many layouts and there are too many text elements. It was just it was going to
right. The sort of the dark side of data merge is that it really wants uniform files. Otherwise, you're just basically you're spending a lot of time writing unique permutations of data merges for specific things. That it's well, if this is unique, we can just. I think the thread that you did on Twitter forever ago was about something in Pamir that had a specific side case that was maybe 50% of the time, but if every card is unique in some specific way, data merge starts to fall apart because it wants that sort of uniformity to operate on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And with ARCS, it was clear that the whole goal of ARCS was to build a template that was so robust it could kind of handle anything, but that was a template that had to be groomed and managed by a human graphic designer. And so what we would do is I would meet with the graphic designer and we would work on our card templates. She would turn them over to me and then I would kind of plug and play the cards. And then over the course of development, they would start drifting and getting a little weird and strange.
And are you just just to pin on that, are you just toggling layers on and off to be this is what this card looks like? Or is there some sort of structured way?
So eventually, to get really specific, we're using oftentimes groups with one like unhidden layer, with like one visible layer. So you go into the group and you're like, yep, I'm going to change the suit of this particular element. And then lots of frame elements. And then just, very robust paragraph styling, just like extreme. I mean, I always tell people when they're learning InDesign, they're like, actually, you're mostly going to be using InDesign by learning how the paragraph styling works, because it's just extremely powerful. And basically any layout that you should be doing at the level of paragraph styling, and don't worry about, like manually styling things. And then, Arcs, but Arcs also has this element of the way it handles its data, which is that we had actually never built a game that was designed to be expanded, which is a funny thing to say given how many expansions Root has. But all the games I've ever worked on, basically what people don't see when they get a Root expansion is Josh and I, especially Josh, sweating bullets trying to like rewrite a core rule in the law of Root to like handle another strange faction interaction. So the law of Root is this like ship of Theseus, where I don't know if like any specific sentence is totally untouched from the first printing. And it's not getting that much longer except for the appendix of factions, but it is like subtly being adjusted constantly to make it stronger so that we can expand the game as much as we are expanding it. But so when we were working on Arcs, one of my first goals was this game is able to be expanded. It is modular. And so I really thought about Arcs more as like a gameplay engine, like a framework that you could then do design within. And the design that you do within that framework is entirely on cards. So like Arcs is a computer that you are like loading your punch cards into, and it's giving you the game. And this was really important to me because if we needed to patch anything, I could send people a little deck of cards. And whenever we need to introduce more content to the game, it's like, here are the cards. Just, you replace the cards that need to be replaced, add the roles in that you need to, that need to be new roles. You don't really need anything else. There's some room for punch board or new wood or things like that, but the vast majority of content in that game sits on the cards. And here if we're thinking about like Oath was a game about kind of like figuring out the structure of its data, Arcs is sort of the next level of that, where it's like, okay, how many different palettes do we need to be working with? How many different kind of options do we need to be? I love reading about early video game programming, because the Commodore 64 comes out and they're like, here are these like chip features that are going to allow you to like do a palette swap or something. And I love learning about it because I'm like, this is so much closer to the type of design work that I'm doing when I'm working at the fundamental, which is actually the place where I'm happiest to work when I'm doing design, is at the most fundamental level. Like I love doing design that is mostly interested in the possibility space of like the core game engine. Content design is fun too. Like all that stuff matters.
So you don't like doing cards actually?
Well, I don't. I mean, I think I always be careful about this because I do enjoy like all the various parts of the process. Like even I usually will find myself helping the pre-press team do graphics towards the end, just to kind of like share the load a little bit. I like that kind of work too. But content design, I always, when I first started working at Leader, Patrick asked me like, what parts of design are you not very comfortable with? And I was like, content design, someone else is going to be better at coming up with magic items than I am going to be.
Yeah. Dude, it's like very validating to hear you say that. Just when I was working on Cantata, I sort of realized like, oh, I like designing systems. I'm good at designing systems. I am very bad at designing units, which is why I brought in someone that had like worked on Star Wars Imperial Assault for Fantasy Flight. Shout out Paul, who like designed all the units. Like he was the person that sat down and was like, should this be 3 or 4? And I was like, I don't want to do that. It's not the type of thing I'm good at. And to sort of, I think you have to be someone who's in the weeds of this type of work to be like, oh, there's like a big distinction between like what it means to design the framework, what it means to design what exists inside that framework, what it means to like design how those two things move together, like to design the sort of topology of the play space itself on top of the framework. That is the boundary between the content. Like those are all very sort of separate disciplines that smell very similar, but can be like in practicality very different in terms of the type of work that someone's doing to validate it. With the sort of moving of stuff to cards, like, is some of the kind of testing work that you've done, like back in the John Company days, like happening again? Like, it's much easier to sort of validate interactions between smaller atomic units inside of a framework compared to sort of a big mess of state in something maybe like an oath. Like, is that something you've thought about for ARCs at all, or are you more thinking about it?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because ARCs has event systems that we were able to like model, and that I needed to, like, for example, ARCs has this in the campaign. There is a non-player entity called the Blight that causes all these problems.
Mm-hmm.
And we went through so many different algorithms for like Blight generation to just figure out, like, we want to get it simple, but also it needs to generate these kinds of outputs. And I just found myself like writing these stupid little Python scripts and being like, let me just see a bunch of different ways that I can like throw these pieces out on the board. And then when it came to the balance of specific plot lines, there were many instances where we would need to run like pretty simple, I mean, almost like a little Monte Carlo or something, just to figure out, like, okay, we have these behaviors, these core dynamics, these different kind of gambits that the players can make. And I'm finding myself writing those like funny little game theory squares where I'm like, okay, player is doing these strategies, herd is doing these strategies. What are the outputs? If I don't know what the outputs are, is it possible to construct a model that will kind of tell me those outputs? And at a certain point it breaks down, because there are just so many combinations, and I don't have a robust enough system to like properly test them. But actually one of the things that it did bear out is earlier systems of the campaign allowed for too much player choice in the pivoting of like plot lines. And what we found was, players are always going to gravitate towards the easy. That's just like what they always want to design a bad game for themselves, unfortunately. And so, we put in some controls for that basically said like, no, it's kind of random. You didn't do very well. Here are 2 options. Make one of them work. And it's because if we gave them like 3 or 4 options, the chance that they were going to pick something that harmonized too easily for their particular strategic position was way too high. So like ARCs is this weird project where ARCs and Oath are 2 sides of the same kind of coin. They are really interested in game and memory in the set, and essentially, like, again, the structure of data. And ARCs is built around narrative structuration. That is the core, the absolute core of how ARCs, like what ARCs saves and why it saves it, is all rooted in a narrative consideration. And in Oath, it is all rooted in a world consideration, in a like, and that is even true of the expansion to a degree. Like, it's really interested in how players relate to the world. And ARCs is much more interested in like how a player is relating to their own story. They're both obviously really interactive, and they have very different ways of communicating their data, but they are similar kinds of like efforts towards that kind of generation.
Do you feel like this is like I don't know, it's like a weird question. Like, do you think that you would ever, I don't know if you would call it, re-implement Oath in ARCs, or like ARCs in Oath, to sort of take a different lens? Like, I think there's a very easy way that like the reach of Oath, like that sort of map, can move towards an ARCs scenario. And then, it's not hard to see them working with each other. Like, is that something that you've ever thought about, as sort of like redesigning? It wouldn't even, I don't even know what that would be called, right? Like, so it would sort of be Oath, but it'd be like Oath on top of ARCs, like as like a sort of concept. Because to your point, like, I think just to top this off, like, I see your designs especially like root Oath ARCs feel like a sort of progression of thought, right? Like, Oath feels like some improvement on root. ARCs feels like an improvement on the ideas of Oath. There's an easy way to see where it's like, well, we could do root, maybe not roots, maybe a little more esoteric, but like I could see an Oath on top of an ARCs
Yeah.
Like that seems like something that could happen. Like, have you thought about sort of revisiting design in that way before?
Well, I have like 3 small responses. So the first one is Arcs has a feature that is built in the game, but that we couldn't finish. It's like a hidden brick of code or like a secret level where it was like, we just didn't finish it, but it exists, which is that in the single session version of Arcs, the winner faction and board state could be used as a seed to start a campaign.
Sure.
And at the end of a campaign, the ending state of a campaign could be used to draft or generate an asymmetric faction in the base game.
Sure.
And like,
yeah,
the first part of that I know works because we did about half of it. And then I was like, we don't have time to finish this and to get it to work properly. But if we, if the game does well and we get to revisit it, I know that I want to get that element to work. There is something like cyclical to Arcs, and the game can behave a little oathy. In fact, one of the biggest arguments I had with the developer about Arcs rather, was about the court deck, because I wanted the court deck, which is the kind of deck that provides special powers that players bid and fight over during the game. I wanted that deck to be sort of adaptable, and you can buy boosters, or you can just mix in cards, and what I was really aiming towards, if you end a campaign, you could use that little court deck in your next base game. Like, that's just like the nature of the world, a little bit like the deck in Oath.
Right.
And he hated this idea. He loved the balanced deck that we ended up coming up with. And I kind of relented on this point because I realized I was, maybe starting to desire.
Trying to be too cute.
I was being too cute, but I was also like, I wanted, maybe there was a part of my heart that just wanted to go back and work on Oath a little bit.
Sure.
Because that was sort of Oath's thing. I've never thought about stitching Oath and Arcs together, although there's this funny thing that happened in the expansions development for Oath is that I was trying to think of, speaking of data, I was trying to think about a way to have players represent their performance in the game in a way. So I was trying to solve this data visualization problem, which is it's hard to make a timeline if you don't know the endpoint. Like, if you think about, if you're playing a Civ game and you load onto the timeline screen, the computer is generating that timeline screen for you because it already knows the start and the end point. It can kind of figure out what the proper scale is and all of that. But if you're just working live, you don't really know how to draw a timeline. You don't even really know how to make a list if you don't know all the items on it. So originally in the end paper to the little Oath journal, I asked Kyle to draw a wall because I was thinking about the lists of kings in Egyptian culture. I'm like, what if you just wrote the names of the winners on this wall? That'd be kind of cool. And some people did and some people didn't. But I wanted some way that multiple games could be registered in one space. And while I was working on Oath, I realized if I gave the players a star map, then the winner could make a constellation of a value that depended on their performance in the game, like a size. And then if you did that 50 times or 100 times or 3 times, it would still be a full sky. And it allows you to see all of the games in one place. And so one of the testers cheekily was like, oh, cool, you filled the sky. Now you can go play Arcs and you're playing a space game now. But because there is this relationship. I mean, I think the core problem with Oath, the core problem as a design, a problem that is not being fixed in the expansion, is that the action system is purposefully a little bland, because all of the color of that game, all of the cleverness of that game sits in the card powers and how the card powers relate to a set of, I'll call them resource conversions, in the sense that a battle is a resource conversion. That's where all the cleverness lives. And the thing that I'm most proud about with Arcs is that Arcs has this very robust and expressive core game engine. And Oath used to have something like that, but players got too clever. And what happened was they would not remember the game that well because they spent most of the game tangling with this complex action system. It was very interesting, but it
changes the focus.
It changes the focus of the game. And it makes me think of if you've played any of Ross Cowman's RPGs like Fall of Magic or City of Winter,
Sure.
they're so
Sure.
direct in their actions, like loop, in their game loop.
Yeah.
And that directness is so important to telling good stories. And I wonder when I look at Oath sometimes, I'm like, there's another way to build one of these games that is a little bit more playful, like maybe halfway to what Arcs is doing. And I don't know if that's a future version of Oath in 10 years or 20 years or something, or if it's a totally different project. But I do wonder if, like, I think if these are two different expressions, like I described these games earlier as two sides of the same coin, two games that were really interested in what is the data that is captured by a moment of play. But I think this might be a many-sided coin. I think there might be like a lot of different ways to
4D coin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there might just be like a lot of different ways to take a state of play and then to fold it into a box. In the same way that we have all of these different, engine builders and all these different legacy games, there might be a lot of games in this space too.
I mean, I think it's definitely, like I mentioned earlier, like something like Earthborn Rangers, I feel like is kind of approaching similar territory and things like Sleeping Gods. And I mean, I'm a fan of Seventh Continent, but it's like in Seventh Citadel, but those are more on the story side.
There's a big difference though, because those games, which I do like, they know all of their cleverness already. Earthborn is the slight exception, because Earthborn, the thing that is amazing about it is how it sometimes doesn't care about you as a player, because you'll be playing and you're like, why are all those animals going that way? And it's like, yeah, you didn't do that. That's the world you're. And then at that moment, suddenly like a big like gust of air comes into the room. Like you like feel like this world is really breathing. If they were to build some way to like have the systems have more emergent properties rather than fully mapped properties, I think they could get there. But I also, like, Earthborn doesn't need to do that because it's already doing, a dozen amazing things.
Mm-hmm. I had one last question.
Fire away.
To sort of like look on like the sort of the tail end, like to complete the circle. So Root has actually been adapted to be a video game by Direwolf. It's out. People can play it on PC, Mac,
Switch,
iPad, Switch, your phone.
That's how my kids learned. I didn't even get a chance to teach my own children Root.
I'm interested in like sort of the data you were able to derive from that, if anything. Like I think it parallels a little bit of what you were talking about with Oath, specifically how like you're kind of getting states from people and you're testing it digitally or whatever. This is sort of different for Root now because it's obviously Root's out. It's not in development. I'm interested in sort of as someone who is like actively working on expansions for a game that also has a very robust video game version. Like I think this is something that people at like, Wizards deal with a lot with like Magic and like Arena. Like there's a lot of arguments to be made that the Magic has changed because Magic the Gathering Arena exists and is very popular. Like I'm wondering how you think about or choose to engage with or not engage with whatever you might get from Root Digital. And presumably like other games that might get adapted in the future. Like how do you think about that in terms of sort of your own design practice? Do you consider it like as you move forward with other stuff? Like, yeah, I'm just interested in sort of your relationship to that. Not like from a business perspective, but more of like a designer person.
So I'm going to rephrase this as like a rhetorical question, which is, do I think StarCraft is better because of the competitive scene and the fans and like the weird custodial relationship that the fans have over StarCraft 2? Right. And like, yes, I do. Like, I think that a competitive scene almost always makes the game better so long as the people curating it are like have the right interests at heart. So maybe I should say a thing about how I think about balance fundamentally, which is that if a faction is imbalanced.
Well, it's also just to interrupt you. Like, I think that is what's also, if I was to answer this question, if I had some situation like this, I think the frustrating part is that this becomes a question of balance, right?
Yes.
Like it's when you have a digital game that is competitive, no one cares about the story. Everyone's going to talk about the balance.
Yeah.
It doesn't care how your like Zerglings moved across the map. And if it was cool and pretty, it's did you win at the end of the game? And I think that like, I don't know if you've thought about doing like an Oath or an Arcs Digital, but it'd be very interesting to see what happens with those games, because I imagine a lot of the conversations around those would also float towards questions of balance versus questions of all the other things you've talked about in this podcast about like what you want a player to take away from.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the balance question, like my impulse whenever someone tells me like this faction is too strong or whatever, is usually like they probably need a liability. I don't want other factions to be stronger. I don't even really necessarily want this faction to be weaker, but I do want them to have like a chink in their armor that you can exploit, because I think the liabilities are what make the game interesting, because it's like this notion of like the strategic gambit. I like want people to feel like they have to make these gambits when they're playing a game. We pay so much attention to tournament results. Like
Really?
Oath has Root has a winter tournament that is run by Garrick Samples and Lily, and there's a bunch of people who run it, and it produces a lot of data. They they have mid-tournament reports that come out and end-of-tournament reports that come out. They talk about all the factions and how they're aware. And it's funny, at the studio we're always rooting for the Corvids because we think that their balance is actually like very close to being correct, if not correct, but that there are things about the tournament meta that like aren't appreciating certain things about how they work.
Sure.
And when we are going in, like when I look at the Discord that is testing the newest Root factions, which is a project that I'm playing Root tomorrow. I mean, I'm in a consulting role with it. Josh wants to make me happy, I think. But I also am not on that team in any meaningful way. Like I give Josh all sorts of suggestions, but I always am careful to say like, I know I designed the original game, but please feel free to ignore me because I haven't played it as much as you have over the last year or whatever. But that Discord is stocked with the most competitive Root players, just expert players who play fast and in fact it like kind of messes with the development process sometimes, because they'll find an exploit and they'll just run the exploit and they're like, faction's broken. And we're like, yeah, can you ignore the exploit for like 3 seconds and just play it? Because you're like wrecking our data a little bit, to the degree to which we take data. The digital Root, they have offered us things like heat maps of like how the maps get used and some faction like specific information, which I think we haven't fully integrated into our process, in part because the digital game is just behind us. Like they only now came out with Marauder, and I'm like way past where you guys are working. So there is like a slowness that is messing with our ability, but I wish I could use it. And in fact, as I'm one reason why when we were selecting partners for Arcs, Direwolf is going to be the one to adapt Arcs. And I, not quite as a condition, but one thing I was interested in it was if they were going to tackle the campaign game. Because I think that there is a very low chance that I got the campaign game balance right the first time out.
You're like, please help me fix it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my favorite plot line in the Arcs campaign is the Believer plot line, which I think is too hard. I think it actually, like, it was always played by the most experienced playtester. And they like in most situations, or as happens when other players at the table are really savvy, they can kind of mess it up. And so the Believer plotline has this problem where, like, if people want it to succeed, which it's fun if it succeeds because it opens up all sorts of weird doors in the game, people will let it. But if the table doesn't want the Believer plotline to happen, it just won't. And that, I mean, it's kind of beautiful, it's a nice thing. It's nice. Yeah, I wish I could say that was on purpose, but actually I do think that, Arcs would benefit from like a 1.1 patch with just like a handful of little adjustments kind of throughout to just strengthen some little elements of play, clean up some things. And in fact, when we were working on Arcs, the version of Arcs that exists and the campaign that exists is actually not the full campaign. We had a bunch of other plot lines that we had to cut that I really wanted to be in the game. And I kind of structured it to say, like, look, and the box is even large enough to do it, where I said, like, hey, if everything goes well, the next 50% of the content we'll put out. And at that same time, I would like to do like a little balance wave to just kind of correct some obvious things. Because if you think about, I mean, in the context of video games, no video game like comes out the gate with like all the numbers perfectly calibrated.
No.
It's like crazy. And so like, I'm always, one of the board game designers I'm so impressed by is Mark Herman, who's a esteemed war game designer. And the balance of Empire of the Sun is staggering. It's like a staggering accomplishment. It's especially staggering because it seems to be just perfect. Like every little strategy has a beautiful counter strategy. There's all these like interesting elements to how the game operates. And I don't think anything that I'll ever make will have that level of calibration. And so I find myself cheating. Like in Pamir, it's essentially there's an auction. I mean, all that waterfall market in Pamir is an auction where the players can assess balance, because now I don't have to worry about it.
Self-balances. Yeah.
And then, the last thing I'll say is, I used to not play digital board games at all. They were not part of my diet. I played turn-based games like Cantata, but I played a lot of games like of that ilk, but like a adapted digital game that was supposed to be a board game was never something that did anything for me. And then like many people, that started changing a little bit during the pandemic. And I've come to really like a well-implemented digital board game. And I think like Oath and Art, I think Oath, if some studio, this is my call to you and your listenership, if some studio wants to do Oath at like with new foundation, like everything, all the stuff we're working on, I will plug you into our development process. You can start working right now. because Oath is, I think, so interesting as a story and as a game, and as a digital game, if I can be branching my world state and sharing it easily, like that it just excites me as a project. And I also don't think it would be that hard to do.
I think the thing that is easy to discount about that is that it's like a separate market,
Yes.
like it's not people who have the physical game who want to play it digitally. It's like, no, there's people who just play digital stuff, and there's people who just play the physical stuff. And there is people who play both. Like I play a lot of Dune Imperium online. I also play it physically when I get a chance to, and I like really enjoy it. But like that is not necessarily the case for every game. Like I think I've played Root. I played Root like in person probably 15 or 20 times, but I've not like, I played digitally like once, and it's like, I think that you just find that it's a separate market of people. And so there's presumably by that same logic, a lot of people that could benefit from playing a well-implemented digital version of Oath, because that will be their relationship to Oath at all. Whereas right now they have nothing, which is it's been an interesting thing to watch. I think Direwolf, the people who are doing Root, it was really interesting to actually see them adapt Dune Imperium to be not the board game. Like it's the board game, but the game itself as played does not look like just the board with digital pieces. And it feels like it feels like they did something there that will be really interesting to see the ramifications of. I mean, presumably for ARCs now, maybe other stuff. Granted, they like own the IP to that, so I think it's like a different situation.
It was a high investment thing. Although they their project, I mean, I know this internally, the Root and Dune Imperium product are very closely commingled in terms of like how they want to handle matchmaking and tournament stuff, and like some of their future plans along those lines. I am also very impressed with the Dune Imperium app. I have the most mixed feelings about Dune Imperium, because to me it's like, and I mean this with a lot of affection, it's like a C+ game, but I also like love it.
It is. It's like it's like a. I feel like it's like being a board game podcast. I agree with you. I don't like that the track doesn't mill enough.
Yeah, it's like
it feels the board state feels so static.
I would have never signed it. I would have been like, I am not using you made me a deck builder where I hardly use my deck. And also like this doesn't feel like Dune at all. And the game is starting. It's also too short. And also, I mean, I have all these like funny concerns about it, but then like my little group that or the group that I'm part of that plays digital board games, they're like, we're going to do a bunch of Dune Imperium. I'm like, yeah, deal me in. I'll play some Dune Imperium casually over 4 days or something.
Are you a Rally of the Troops person?
Yeah, I am. Drew and I have played, my brother and I have played a lot of Nevsky on Rally of the Troops. I played a lot of Plantagenet. Nice. We were playing Washington's War a few days ago. He's trying to start a game of Maria right now. Rally the Troops is incredible.
It's like truly Rally the Troops, for people who don't know, is sort of like war gamey version of like Board Game Arena. but all the games are. Is it just this one guy?
I think there's like two
all
now,
of them?
but basically it was mostly built by this guy.
It's
Tor.
like yeah. He just does all of these like it's sort of handcrafted implementations of board games, but specifically like kind of war games, and it's very good. And it's free.
Yep, and you can play Pax Pamir if you're interested in Pax Pamir.
Pamir's there.
You can play Pax Pamir on it. It's a great implementation. You can play. There's a while where I was playing a game of Pax Pamir like over lunch.
Yeah, great. Well, we've been talking for nearly 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
I feel like we covered everything.
I'm happy for, despite really rambling there at the start, like an arrow. We've been since then.
Yeah, you did a great job keeping us on track. I appreciate you moving through your oov. Your oov is now
just cut the first 10 minutes of the podcast. Will be great. Yeah, my wife just pinged me. She's like, "You still want to watch that David Lynch documentary?" I'm like, "Yeah, That's
Oh, I got All right,
I know it really. What a run! What an incredible
run!
Like I really love the Blank Check podcast. I just love film. And they did an episode on Inland Empire for their like David Lynch series, and in the middle of it, their guest it's almost like he's speaking in tongues. Like he goes into a real moment of rapture, just talking about like how much Inland Empire has like meant to him, and I wanted to like clap. Like I've never listened to a podcast before and like wanted to like give applause, but I was so moved by it. And his little speech he gave has just been like ringing in my head since I found the news. It's so sad.
I'm going to go find that. That's a great end to our podcast about board games and video games, is to go deal with the better media of film and go watch David.
Yeah, there you go. That's how I'm into my night.
Cole, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Kyle, this was a blast.
Yeah, I'm excited to have got to talk to you finally about all of the nitty gritty bits that you deal with day to day as one of the few full-time board game designers. Thanks, Cole. Do you want to plug anything?
Do you want to plug anything?
You go? I know you talked about everything. Yeah.
A game I co-designed with a wonderful new designer named Joe Kelly in the UK called Molly House is coming out soon. You can maybe pre-order it still. I don't think so. Maybe it'll be out soon. You'll be able to pre-order in like a month or two, and it'll be showing up on people's doorsteps in that same time frame. It's so good and it's so weird, and I want everyone to play it.
You got to tell people what Molly House is
sorry.
That's the tagline.
Boy, this is I guess I'm not an academic 18th century podcast. Molly houses were essentially gay clubs in the early 18th century. They were like part, hookup scene, part safe place, part like drag ball, or maybe all of those things or just one of them. And there is this amazing, what today we'd call a queer community that like formed around these Molly houses in the 1720s. And then the behavior was crushed by this citizens group called the Society for the Reformation of Manners. And so the game is about throwing parties and trying to, fulfill your desires while also avoiding the notice of your nosier neighbors. And it is just like, I love this design because we set out to make a game about fun, about parties, and about community. And it is an outrageously like mean and strange and delightful game. And it's one of those that like, I really have no idea how well it's going to be received because, if you look, it's a game about parties, which means sometimes you go to a party and you have a blast. Other times you go to a party and you immediately regret having gone to that party. And both of those things can happen in the game. And I just don't know how people are going to react. But if you're interested in Molly House, you can search it. You'll eventually be able to get a copy. It's coming out within the next couple months. And I'm just extremely proud of it as a piece of design. I'm tremendously proud of the work that Joe did on the initial design and in the long months of development afterwards. The one thing I'll say about it is when Joe asked, so I asked to look at it because Joe was a mentee of mine. And when I expressed my interest in the design, I told Joe that the idea for the game was brilliant, that there were certain parts of the game I really liked, but that basically if they were to want to work with me, I would want them to restart the design. And I said, I don't know how long it's going to take us to get this design right. I don't know what our relationship is going to be during this process. Maybe I'll just be your editor. Maybe I'll end up being a co-designer. Maybe I'll be a developer. But if you want to go on this long, weird journey with us, I will go on it. We will go on it with you, Drew and I. And it was a 2.5 year process. And I'm just so happy with our strange child. It's a delight. And it's such a weird game.
I'm excited for it. I think I backed it, so I should hope to see it on my doorstep as well.
Yeah, probably into February,
cool.
March. I don't know. Depends on the ocean.
Yeah, it tends to, hold things up. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast, Cole. To everyone listening to Game Day, thank you so much. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends, and see you all next time.